Hello there students, Mr. Little here, and I'm glad you're here, and I hope you had an excellent summer. As you can see, I've got a bit of a new setup for a new year. So, yes, to answer your question, I'm going to take this channel in a bit of a broader direction, still centered on history, but not linked to a particular class. I may still post an occasional lecture, but I don't want that to be my main product anymore on this channel. Oh, and I have an intro reel now, check it out. Wow, 2020, whew, what a year. Between the pandemic, landmark civil rights protests, and one of the most contentious elections in recent American history, you'd be forgiven for missing some news that didn't pertain to those things. But as it turns out, scholars of the past do not rest, and 2020 was no exception. There continue to be fascinating developments in the fields of history and archaeology. And so in no particular order, here are 3 history-related discoveries in 2020, and hey, 3 is a small number, so if you learned about any amazing developments and discoveries in history and archaeology, share it below in the comments. First up, the female hunter. So, you know the old saying, bringing home the bacon? Well, it has long been assumed that in non-agricultural hunting and gathering societies and bands, men primarily did that is, the hunting, bringing back the bacon. Well, maybe in this case, bringing home the giant woolly mammoth. Historically, among academics, there was the perception that the traditional division of labor in hunting and gathering bands was based on gender. Men were doing the hunting, and women were doing the gathering. This perception was popularized by early European anthropologists in the 1800s. In particular, it was argued that pregnancy, childbirth, and child rearing meant women could not participate in the hunt. Therefore, women were responsible for the gathering. This idea of women as gatherers, however, is not a slight. Hunting massive game like a mammoth is dangerous and time-consuming, and even when the kill is successful, most of the game cannot be carried back or preserved by the band. Overall, the majority of calories consumed by a hunting and gathering band would come from roots, tubers, wild berries, small animals, and wild grains. This assumption, however, has received some major damage. From new research published in the journal Science Advances in 2020, archaeologists examining 107 burial sites in South America examined 427 skeletons of the objects they were buried with. Their work determined that 27 of those skeletons were buried with kits used to kill big game. Specifically, quote, the kit included a full suite of big game procurements and processing tools, including stone projectile points used to dispatch big game, the back-to-knife and lithic flakes to field dress harvest game, the large scrapers and choppers to extract bone marrow or process hides, the small scrapers for detailed hide work, and the cobbles and ochre to tan the hides. Of those 27 skeletons, 12 of them were female and 15 of them were male, indicating that women did indeed participate in big game hunts. And just in case you think this might have been some sort of ancient mix-up at the ancient morgue, the researchers state, the stacking and topological integrity of the artifact clusters indicate that the artifacts were likely interned as an integrated toolkit. In the paper's conclusion, researchers state, quote, both female and male hunter burials occur in statistical parity. Of course, this begs many other questions. If not gender, then what dynamics determined who hunted? Were there special all-women hunting units? Were there men who did the gathering versus the hunting? Obviously, much research remains to be done, but this is a reminder that our understanding and deepest assumptions about gender roles, abilities, and the history of the sexes is constantly evolving. Next, a note from Auschwitz. In many ways, the study of the past is a race against time. The raw and real testimonies about events of the past are lost when individuals who witness those events die, if these testimonies are not recorded in some way. This can impact how we remember the past, both for better and for worse. Understanding that, it was an important development in July of 2020 when Holocaust researchers at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum discovered a name written on a child's shoe. Many of us are familiar with the many photos of liberated concentration camps, which include piles of shoes. The sheer size of these stacks of footwear testify to the murderous intent of the Nazi regime and the scale of their crimes, as well as serving as a testimony to their victims. Riding on and in shoes is actually not unusual. According to researchers at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum, many concentration camp prisoners used paper to insulate their shoes and make them last longer, so things such as news articles and wrapping paper is apparently not an uncommon find. What made this interesting was the name that was written on the shoe, which was Emil Steinberg. Now, the story might have ended there, but researchers already had another artifact with the name Steinberg on it, specifically a suitcase now believed to belong to Amos's father, Ludwig Steinberg. The Steinbergs were a Jewish family living in Czechoslovakia. Now, during World War II, the family was interned by the Nazi regime in a ghetto outside of Prague, before being deported to Auschwitz in 1944. Sadly, Amos and his mother, Ida Steinberg, did not survive. It is believed that they were murdered shortly after their arrival in the camp. However, Ludwig Steinberg did survive the war. He moved to Israel in 1949, where he changed his name to Yehuda Shinan and worked in education until he passed away in 1985. He remarried after the war and is survived by 6 grandchildren and 14 great-grandchildren. The discovery of the shoe, along with photos and documents, transforms a small footnote in the wider history of the Holocaust into a human story, more able to be understood by us in the 21st century, separated from the Holocaust by the gulf of time. According to the director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum, speaking on the connection of the shoe with the suitcase and other documents, quote, "Objects inextricably linked to Auschwitz lose the anonymity weighing down on them and acquire a deeper, individual significance. As objects of great documentary value, the shoe is proof of the suffering of a particular person." And finally, a meeting in the Pacific. A quick glance at the globe indicates that the Earth is divided into 2 hemispheres. For most of written human history, these hemispheres were geographically isolated from one another. We know that in 1492, with the voyages of Columbus, regular trade and unbroken communication was established between the western and eastern hemispheres. However, childlike curiosity demands that we determine who wins the title of the first person or peoples to connect the hemispheres. Now, technically, the answer to this question is the Norse settlements in what are now Canada around the turn of the first millennia. These are the first documented contacts between the hemispheres. Even if we grant, for example, the account of the ruler of Mali sending a fleet to the western hemisphere, or the claim that the Chinese Admiral Zheng He reached the Americas in 1421, these occurred after the confirmed Norse expeditions. And I should also note these 2 claims are currently not supported by archaeological evidence or the scholarly community. However, another claim of pre-Columbian cross-hemispheric contact was in fact vindicated in 2020. Research published in the journal Nature, and building upon earlier research from 2014, looked at over 800 genetic samples taken from 17 Pacific Island Polynesian groups and 15 Native American groups, and found samples with genetic features from both of these groups. According to researchers, this suggests, quote, "A single contact event occurred in eastern Polynesia before the settlement of Rapa Nui in 1400 CE between Polynesian individuals and a Native American group most closely related to the indigenous inhabitants of present-day Colombia." The extent of these mixed genetic samples across the Pacific Islands indicates that this contact was long-term and included more than just the trading of material goods, if you know what I mean. The story of the Polynesian colonization of the Pacific Islands from around 800 to the year 1400 is an amazing story in and of itself. Polynesian technologies such as outrigger canoes or navigation techniques such as cloud spotting made long voyages possible. This idea of contact between seafaring Polynesians and seafaring Native Americans has been debated among scholars for a long time. For example, how does one explain the presence of American food crops in the Pacific, such as sweet potatoes, or that a voyage across the Pacific in a canoe in 1947 by Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl proved it was possible to reach the Pacific Islands from the coast of South America. Of course, there were counter-arguments, for example, that the spread of sweet potatoes did not require human activity. Before 2020, there was no smoking gun, or in this case, no smoking canoe. Although researchers cannot definitively say where this contact between Polynesians and Native Americans took place, it occurred sometime around the year 1200 CE. This date hinges on which Pacific Islands populations had the mixed genetic sequences. Islands discovered after 1200 CE included populations with the mixed genetic sequences, specifically the Polynesia Islands and Rapa Nui, indicating that the contact took place sometime before the discovery of those islands by the Polynesians. This discovery is important because it is a reminder that Europeans were not the only ones going out and exploring the world around this time, and perhaps we ought to consider a more global age of exploration with a global context. Keep in mind, a good number of the tools Christopher Columbus himself used either had their origins in Asia or were introduced to medieval Europe via people from Asia and Africa. The compass is from ancient China, the astrolabe was from North Africa, and the quadrant was from the Middle East. All of these tools of Asian and African origin helped make European exploration possible. The discovery of the mixed Polynesian Native American genetic sequences should also serve as a testament to the seafaring abilities of those people and of the Asian contribution to the age of exploration. And there you have it, 3 interesting discoveries from the year 2020. If you found one of these interesting, let me know in the comments section below. And if you learned something interesting from 2020, please share it in the comments section below. As a reminder that history never stops and we are always learning new things. Speaking of which, I hope you will like and subscribe to this channel so we can keep learning interesting things. But I want to thank you so much for joining me. My name is Mr. Little, and I'll see you.